welcome back. We're continuing our discussion of Louise Erdrich's Love Medicine. And this time I'm going to be looking at the fourth chapter, or the fourth section, entitled The Island. And unlike the previous sections, this one does not have a date attached to it. However, we discover as it goes on that it is connected to the events in the previous two chapters, which sets it in 1934, at least in part. Although it also seems to span maybe some amount of time. In the last two sections, we talked about identity, social and cultural identity, and how the idea of one culture that comes in and sits on top of another culture and maybe strips that other culture away is an important reading of this book. We also talked about the interesting narrative aspects of this book and how it is not chronological or sequential, but rather jumps around in time and jumps around in narrator as well. This particular chapter is narrated by a character who we have not yet met. Her name is Lulu Nanapush. There was some reference to her in the last chapter, as we saw that Nectar Cashpaw had a relationship with her before he threw that away to connect with Marie. Lulu's language is very poetic throughout this. And there's a lot of really great narrative aspects to this chapter as well. But what I want to focus on in this particular chapter is the idea of setting, and how setting interplays with some of the other things that we've talked about. Notice how this chapter begins in the Catholic school, but then transitions, as the title indicates, to the island. What's the difference between these two settings? And also the intermediary setting of old Uncle Nanapush's house, with Rush's bear. Lulu begins as a young child, but this is sort of a coming-of-age chapter, in which she discovers herself and begins to grow as a woman. Pay attention to how that change and transformation is mapped out in the setting. The Catholic school, to Nanapush's house, to the island. And she, like most of the other characters, is undergoing something of a crisis of identity. As Nectar Cashpaw rejects her and tosses her away, she is seeking something to find meaning in afterwards. What does the Catholic school say about cultural identity? What does the island, with Moses Pillager, say about identity? It's interesting that Moses is someone who doesn't have an identity. His name is hidden and secret. His mother tricked death by pretending that he was dead. And so he is a kind of person who, while being without a self, has a kind of knowledge that other characters have difficulty finding for themselves. What is it that Lulu discovers about herself and about the world by the end of this chapter? And why does she have to do it on the island as opposed to in one of the other settings? And don't forget, we've been looking at religious symbolism and how it's being reused in a kind of interesting way. It's worth noting that there is a crossing of water here to a character named Moses, who kind of guides our central character Lulu to a new understanding of herself and the world, even if he doesn't really desire to. At least not at first. One of the most interesting things about this book is that it poses more questions than it answers. So keep asking those questions as you're reading it, and I'll see you next time as we look at the next couple chapters. Bye-bye. What I want to focus on and draw your attention to as we're looking at this